Thanks for joining us on our streaming service for your First Alert avalanche forecast. I'm your First Alert meteorologist, Callie Zanandri. And joining me now is Brian Lazar from the Colorado Avalanche Information Center. Brian, we are seeing unseasonably warm temperatures across Colorado right now. What's that doing to the snowpack?
Man, it is crazy hot out there. We're on, a week of record-breaking temperatures. We're approaching 9 days without the snowpack freezing. And as you can imagine, this has taken quite a toll on our snowpack. I'll start by kind of showing where we sit statewide. You can see here that a lot of those oranges and reds are not good colors. We are below 40%. Statewide percent of long-term median is sitting at 34% as we talk here today. You can see just what this last week of record-breaking temperatures has done to our snowpack. So as a reminder, that red line is the long-term daily minimum. The green is the long-term median, which is what we're shooting for. And you can see that little green X is our typical peak date for snowpack in the state, which is early April. So we are coming up on it, and we are nowhere near long-term median. You can see that steep decline is due to all those record-breaking temperatures we've had over the last week, and even the most optimistic prognosis going forward is not all that awesome. So all those dotted lines are, what might happen into the future. You can see even that most top bluish purple line would be us setting a daily maximum snow water equivalent record every day, and even if we did that for the rest of the season, we barely get back to long-term median, and even the chances of that happening are slim to none. So you can see if we end up somewhere in the middle of the road, even if we get some wet April, May storms, our chances of getting back to long-term median are next to zero at this point, I'm sad to report.
Yeah, just really unfortunate conditions this winter. How do these unseasonably warm temperatures actually change the stability of the snowpack? And why does that heat make avalanches, especially wet ones, more likely and more dangerous?
Yeah, so we're pumping, as you can imagine, a tremendous amount of meltwater into the snowpack, and that does a couple things, and it does give us a couple varieties of wet avalanche activity. But as we pump a lot of meltwater into the snowpack, we start to produce cohesionless snow in the upper snowpack. And in thin snowpack areas, the water's made it all the way to the ground, and we have cohesionless snow pretty much from top to bottom. And so our most in-your-face avalanche problem are these loose, wet avalanches. What I want to point out here in this graphic is that these avalanche conditions have moved around even onto north-facing terrain, even up into the alpine. This is not something we typically would see until late April, but here we are in late March with loose, wet avalanches even affecting the coldest, driest snow at the highest, shadiest slopes. And we're seeing, as you can imagine, a big uptick in loose, wet avalanche activity. We've mentioned some of those clear signs that loose, wet avalanche activity are imminent, including unsupportable snow surfaces when those crusts start breaking down. And we get roller balls, pinwheels, and conditions like what you can see here in this video, where you can't even on skis move through without punching kind of through into this super soft snow underneath. And what that's doing is allowing all of this unconsolidated snow to essentially move easily in loose, wet avalanches. And some of these are gouging down to the ground even because, like I said, meltwater has made it that deep. Really easy to trigger, but unfortunately we get some really good signs from Mother Nature. Here's just an example of some recent loose, wet avalanche activity, a natural from yesterday in Red Lady Bowl outside of Crested Butte. And here's one that ran right near Vail, and you can see how it started as a little point release up high above the cliffs and then gouged down to the ground. So although these things are kind of easy to predict and Mother Nature does give us some pretty clear signs, we do want people to realize when it's time to exit steep avalanche terrain, because getting caught in something like this, could certainly lead to injury or worse.
And Brian, you're also still warning about large, destructive, wet slab avalanches. Where are those risks highest right now?
Yeah, and those are, almost what's really driving the danger. These are not as in your face, but they're much more dangerous because of the volume of snow that they entrain. And they're a little bit harder to predict. But what we have seen is the wet avalanche activity also creep around under the north side of the compass. So when we say wet slabs, what we mean is we've had all these persistent weak layers in the snowpack that you and I have been discussing throughout the course of the winter. We're pumping a lot of meltwater into the snowpack, and when those weak layers see water for the first time, they get really weak, really fast and will often fail in the form of wet slab avalanches. And I'll show you what some of those look like. But of note here is that they've moved around again into the cold snow, even up at the near tree line elevation on north-facing slopes. The size varies depending on where you go in the state, but some of the ones we've seen over the last few days are hitting this very large, very destructive and deadly size category. And here Jason gives us a really good description of what this wet slab setup looks like.
And collapse on, it's pretty mellow slope, so I'm not worried about it, under 30 degrees. But what's going on here is this weak layer of basal fastest and depth hoar is getting super wet and weakening even more than it already was. It already was weak before it got wet, and that collapsed, and we got this big crack. It didn't slide because it wasn't steep enough. But what I really want to show you is as soon as I got out of trees, the snowpack became really supportable to skis. So it's really deceiving. When it gets supportable, it's actually more dangerous because that's where the slab is.
So as Jason described, you can see that these slabs are going to fail on those underlying wet, weak layers of snow. The most problematic slopes are going to be those that, are the most sun-drenched and see a lot of the meltwater. So even in these steep, rocky areas on northern-facing slopes, these rocks heat up, they put meltwater in the snowpack, and we'll see some of these wet avalanches go. You can see that the size, here's one, if you look at the left side of the image down in the San Juan Mountains, and you can see the size is getting quite big and quite scary. And here's one from Fremont Pass. You can imagine getting caught in these things, gouging down to the ground are going to really be easy to hurt someone or worse. Some of these are getting quite big. Here's one from Gothic, and you can see just from yesterday, getting caught in avalanche debris that's moving like this is really hard to survive. These are churning avalanches, and it's like being in a cement mixer. So you really need to make sure that you're avoiding these slopes where we're warning about wet slab avalanche activity, because these are going to be really dangerous if you find yourself in one.
Now, a pattern change bringing cooler temperatures this weekend. How do you expect avalanche conditions to evolve? And as you've warned, that window for safe travel may be very short or even non-existent. What clear signs should people watch for when it's time to turn around?
Yeah, it's a great question. We are moving back into a slightly more normal paradigm. So as we put in our weather forecast yesterday, we're moving out of the record-breaking hot temperatures into just unseasonably warm temperatures as we move towards the weekend. Here's a temperature graph from near Berthoud Pass. We do have a cold front that moves through tonight, and that'll have the biggest impact in the northern mountains, particularly along and east of the Continental Divide. What I want to point out here is this first peak in the graph is Thursday. This is going to be our hottest period of this whole record-breaking temperature, but then we do get a good freeze, and it's pretty pronounced in the northern mountains. That is great news for ameliorating the wet avalanche activity, and so we should get a good freeze overnight. That gets us back into these windows of opportunity where we have some safe travel in the morning. So it's back into the mantra of start and end your day early. Look for the obvious signs that the surface freeze is breaking down. That is, the snowpack is no longer to support you. You start punching through on skis or in your boots, which I encourage everyone to get out of their travel mode, walk around on the snowpack. If you start punching through up to your waist, it's time to move out of avalanche terrain. If you start to see pinwheels, roller balls, slushy surface conditions more than about 6 inches deep, or you start to see small, loose, wet avalanches popping out of rocky terrain. Now, the cold front does not have as much of an impact as we move into the central and southern mountains. And so as an example, I picked Independence Pass here. This is for 11,600 feet. Welcomely, we do get a freeze here on Thursday night, and you can see we start to get freezes every night as we move through the week, which is great news. This does not mean that we can put wet avalanche concerns to bed completely. We are still seeing daytime highs maxing out up into the 40s, and so we're going to have these windows of safer travel in the morning before things start to break down in the afternoon. And as you can see here, the graph does start to plummet as we move into the early part of next work week, and we will flip the switch again. So we will kind of put most of our wet avalanche concerns to bed as we move into Monday and Tuesday. We do have some precipitation, and it's frozen. We do have some snow coming next week. We're looking at maybe 6 to 12 inches across a lot of mountain areas. So we will stop talking about wet avalanche concerns next week, and we'll move back into wind drifted and cold snow. And these kinds of wild fluctuations are not uncommon for Colorado in the spring.
Brian, you've been doing this a long time. Have you ever seen conditions like this in March?
No, I have not. I have been doing this a long time. I cannot remember such a prolonged hot period of weather in middle of March. 9 days without freezing temperatures in the middle of March, I don't think I've seen in my career in Colorado.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, Brian.
Thank you. We'll see you next week.
Yeah, we'll see you next week for your First Alert Avalanche Report.